Ethel Merman's Broadway debut in 1930 has become the stuff of legend, garnering reviews that any performer would dream of. Miss Merman's effect was such that there was every reason to believe that they would make her sing all night. Imitative of no one, she shouts, she ravishes the words, and her O's go sailing out over the orchestra like balloons. Miss Merman tied the proceeding in knots. This girl bids fair to become the toast of Broadway. She would go on to be regarded as one of the greatest entertainers in Broadway history, with many exalting her as the Queen of Broadway, with her massive, indestructible voice and her electric stage persona that demanded one's attention. She's also regarded as one of Broadway's most formidable stars, with a reputation behind the scenes that would eventually inform the roles she'd play on stage. This episode will follow her career through its various stages, her tumultuous private life that made her fodder for gossip columnists, and despite several attempts at making the transition to the big screen, she would always find herself at home on the Broadway stage. To keep things moving along, I won't be able to go into detail about every show she ever did, sorry in advance, but I will hit on some of her biggest shows that would help establish her persona in popular culture, and also explore how her influence reverberates with Broadway singers today. And before we get started, make sure to like this video, and if you're new to this channel, hi, hello, please make sure to subscribe and check out some of my other episodes. When Ethel Merman made her Broadway debut, it seemed to many that she had come out of nowhere. In fact, she'd slowly been making a name for herself as a club singer for 6 years before this, all while working as a secretary to support herself. Not exactly the overnight sensation story we'd like to imagine, but when she finally did hit in 1930, she came forth as something new, modern, startling. She'd been born Ethel Zimmerman in Astoria, Queens, to working middle-class parents. The year of her birth is often disputed, with many generally accepting 1908, though Ethel would always claim she was born in 1912. Her earliest influences as a performer came from vaudeville. Her family regularly took the subway into Manhattan to take in the mecca of vaudeville talent at the Palace Theater. Vaudeville at this time was the most popular form of entertainment in the country. Radio was in its infancy. Phonograph recordings, while commercially available, were not yet common in the average household, and silent movies, while growing in popularity, were still considered novel while exploring their fuller potential. Outside of vaudeville, Ethel never really showed any interest in glitzy Broadway revues like the Ziegfeld Follies or the sophisticated musicals of the Princess Theater down on 39th Street, preferring the broad, the keyword is broad here, variety of performers at the Palace Theater, and this would no doubt have a huge impact on her own stage persona. Ever practical, Ethel decided to shorten her surname to Merman, knowing it would be far easier to fit on a bill than Zimmerman. Her voice was said to be strong from the beginning, and never given to formal training. By the time she started making her way as a singer, Ethel went the way of other young performers of this time. Women singers often stuck to torch songs, that is, sentimental doormat ballads about unrequited or lost love. And Ethel was no different. But this was also the 1920s. New York, like the rest of America, was amid the Jazz Age, and the bold, brassy arrangements of the Prohibition era would be a formative time for Ethel as a singer. The electric microphone, which had just started making its rounds in nightclubs, was not always a guarantee at the venues that Ethel managed to be booked at, thus challenging her, along with countless others, to be heard over brassy arrangements and rowdy crowds at New York speakeasies. In 1930, she caught the attention of producer Vinton Friedley, who immediately booked her to audition for George and Ira Gershwin in their upcoming Broadway show, Girl Crazy. Ethel would go on to be cast as Kate, a saloon keeper's daughter who becomes the star entertainer of a makeshift club on a dude ranch in Arizona. The show's plot was convoluted and flimsy, not unlike most Broadway shows of this time. Another young unknown in this cast was Ginger Rogers, playing the show's romantic ingenue, Molly, who ends up with the show's leading man. But the role of Kate proved far showier, with Ethel's astute characterization, and word spread during rehearsals of an exciting new talent in the show. The opening night was on October 14th, 1930. George Gershwin himself conducted the premiere performance, with the likes of Benny Goodman, Jimmy Dorsey, Gene Krupa, and Glenn Miller playing in the pit. The audience had been enjoying the first act well enough when Ethel stepped forward and launched into the bluesy Sam and Delilah. It was her first song, rather late in the evening, and the audience was totally taken aback. Brian Kello writes in his biography of her, Ethel toyed with a cigarette, and her provocative costume, a black satin skirt slit daringly high, red silk blouse, garter, and ankle straps caused a stir of its own. But when she opened her mouth, the audience was both delighted and riveted. It was a sexy, funny blues song, and Ethel's precise delivery guaranteed that every single joke came through. She finished the song to a big ovation, then immediately afterward came I Got Rhythm. In form, the song was simple enough, but Ethel took command of it, and most thrillingly, belted out her high note, a C5 above middle C to be exact, for a reported length of 16 bars. Some have alleged it was actually 32 bars. The audience exploded. Dorothy Fields, who was in the audience that night, recalled, "It was an ovation like you just can't believe," and Ethel seemed a little stunned herself. She stood there not quite believing it, and encore after encore, no one had ever held a note like that, beyond the length of endurance. Now, Ethel was by no means the first belter. Even before her, performers like Sophie Tucker, Libby Holman, Bessie Smith, and Ethel Waters were well known by then for utilizing a full-chested belt sound. But with Ethel Merman's own distinct sound, combined with her animated arm gestures and body wisecracking stage persona, she stood apart, nothing like the demure and passive personas like Ruth Etting or Helen Morgan, nor ingenues like Ginger Rogers in the very same show. Brian Kello suggests that singers of this period whose sound Ethel most resembled were that of men, citing singers like Harry Richman and Al Jolson, who could warble with endless legato, then attack a phrase with directness and clarity. After her successful opening in Girl Crazy, Ethel signed a 10-picture deal with Paramount, that is short 1 or 2 reel films that would play before feature lengths or in between acts in vaudeville. She actually filmed some of these shorts at Paramount's production studio in Queens at the same time she was appearing in Girl Crazy. In many, which you can find on YouTube, we can see Ethel's brash persona starting to take shape, all the while emulating a more genteel style. Let's take The Devil in the Sea for starters, where her character mourns the loss of her lover in a shipwreck.
The sea took him, and the sea will hold him.
He'll come back. He's alive. I know he'll come back.
The first song in this reel is a mournful torch ballad. Vocally, she pulls back when she needs to, flipping into a floaty soprano, but her signature belt is never far away. Then in her second song, when she learns he is not lost after all, she's finally able to let go, launching into a jazzy revival song where she revs herself up. Mort Blumenstock, who wrote and directed this short, uncannily repeats this in another short, Her Future, where she appears on the stand for some nebulous crime, only to be granted freedom so long as she promises to never break the law again. The plots of these shorts would fall apart at the slightest analysis, but Ethel usually comes off pretty well in them. If anything, they establish her torch song persona in contrast with her more bombastic, probably more instinctive performance style. She appears less convincing when conspicuously placed in roles and situations that do not suit her well, as in the 1931 short, Old Man Blues, really a 10-minute operetta on film. Despite her best efforts, she is totally miscast as the demure and forlorn ingenue. It's really the kind of role that Jeanette MacDonald would thrive in on screen in only a few years. Ethel would go on to appear on Broadway in shows like The George White Scandals and Take a Chance, mostly in supporting roles that utilize her voice to great effect. But her showbiz persona would get a huge boost from composer Cole Porter. With a book by Howard Lindsay and Russell Crouse, Anything Goes premiered on Broadway in 1934. In it, Ethel plays Reno Sweeney, an evangelist turned nightclub singer taking a cross-Atlantic cruise to Europe. Cole Porter had been impressed with her performance in Girl Crazy, and when writing for Ethel, he scored her songs to suit her instrument. Knowing what high notes pinged and sounded best in her voice, he usually determined an A natural, B flat, or C natural above middle C. But he also marveled and trusted her musicality, intuitively adding a bluesy effect to her notes for comic effect, and her crisp articulation where every word she sang could be heard. Anything Goes was an enormous hit, and Ethel Merman's performance as Reno Sweeney elevated her status as a Broadway comedienne. She would tell the press, "The show gives me a chance for the first time to sing straight lyrics that aren't of the torch song order. I don't have to sound like a Sandy Hook foghorn." In 1936, she would go on to reprise the role for the movie version of Anything Goes, starring alongside Bing Crosby. With the beginning of the Great Depression and the end of Broadway's decadence from the 1920s, many Broadway performers and writers had made the trek to Hollywood in hopes of finding success working in movies. Not dissimilar to today, success on Broadway does not guarantee success in Hollywood. Ethel had actually come to Anything Goes as a second choice to Bing Crosby's wife, Dixie Lee, who had initially been offered the part. Further, the part of Reno had been significantly cut, with most of the film focusing on the character of Billy and Ethel strangely being made the straight man to Bing Crosby.
Yeah, I get it. I get everything, except what I want.
While Ethel was obviously disappointed in this, there was never any animosity between her and Crosby. The two had actually appeared previously in 1934's We're Not Dressing, and by all accounts, got on famously on the set of Anything Goes. Ethel's real conflict was Hollywood itself. She had been left uneasy by Paramount's treatment of her in 1934, their blunt assessment about her looks and how she appeared on camera, cutting her hair short before smacking a long wig on her head, never quite sure what to make of her. She also reportedly longed for New York life, and often complained about Hollywood being a 9 o'clock town with little to speak of for a nightlife then. She told a reporter in 1934, "Don't get me wrong, I like to go to Hollywood once in a while to make pictures alright, but what a dull life it is out there. There's just nothing to do. New York's the place for me, and anybody that's got the swing of it like I have can't break out of it so easily. Yes sir, Broadway's the life, and I'm going to stick by it as long as I can." She wouldn't fully give up her plans for Hollywood, going on to book a picture deal with Darryl F. Zanuck and 20th Century Fox for 1937's Happy Landing, starring alongside Cesar Romero. If the studios didn't know how to best use Ethel in the beginning, they at least made a significant effort this time around. She received the studio makeover treatment, penciled eyebrows, royer gowns. The studio even arranged her much-publicized dates with Cesar Romero to generate publicity, even though it was quietly understood by Ethel, along with the rest of Hollywood, that Cesar Romero was gay. She fared far better in her next film with 20th Century Fox, 1938's Alexander's Ragtime Band. Think of this as an early jukebox movie musical, with a convoluted plot built on featuring the songs of Irving Berlin. In it, Ethel plays Jerry Allen, a band singer with a big voice who briefly stands in as a possible love interest to Tyrone Power, who, if anyone is wondering, I just think is really handsome in this film. She doesn't really act much in this movie, but is utilized best in her singing performances. The film was a success, unlike her next movie, Straight, Place, and Show, which, after its poor reception, led Ethel to fire her agent. She quickly noticed the studio casting her in the same tertiary roles, a sophisticated, wisecracking dame singer with a heart of gold, who stands in as a temporary love interest between a movie's feuding couple before they reunite and reconcile. And despite toning down her performances and how successfully this was translating on film, she still felt constricted and limited performing for the camera. After Straight, Place, and Show, she would only appear in one film throughout the next decade, very briefly in 1943's Stage Door Canteen, which also briefly featured an appearance by striptease artist Gypsy Rose Lee. Ethel would always feel more at home and more appreciated on the Broadway stage, with musicals like Red Hot and Blue, Stars in Your Eyes, and Du Barry Was a Lady. It's here where the lore of Ethel Merman really begins establishing itself. Let's start with the onstage persona. Without the camera's demanding expectations to tone things down, Ethel could be herself, not just with her booming voice, but with her physicality as well. Broad hand gestures up over her head or reaching out to the audience, and those enormous eyes that would beam all the way up to the top balcony. The broadness in her style speaks to her earliest vaudeville influences, before the influences of radio and film and the gradual honing in of stage performances. This would very much be her style throughout her career. No microphone, out in one, performing right out to the audience. She became known as a quick study, and many in her companies marveled at how fast she took in new material that was thrown at her during out-of-town tryouts. But she would soon grow impatient and restless with changes after a period, eventually establishing a hard and fast rule: no changes the week before opening. Years later, when Irving Berlin presented her with new lyrics for a song, she reportedly quipped, "Call me Miss Birdseye. It's Frozen." Admittedly, this Canadian millennial had to Google that reference, but it makes a lot more sense after I did so. Over the years, Ethel Merman's offstage life would become a source of speculation. Normally, I don't like to focus on the private lives of my subjects, but the persona that Ethel developed on stage was often folded into what the press would write about her. They had been fascinated, if somewhat bemused by Ethel Merman. They initially spun her as a down-to-earth go-getter, the attractive, if not beautiful, humble secretary who became an overnight star. Ethel would recount her days as a stenographer throughout her career, showing Johnny Carson here how she took down instructions in shorthand. This, again, was a conflation of facts, and in spite of her success on Broadway, she never really saw herself as an actress, more as a singer, though with every Broadway show, she was steadily establishing herself as a capable comedienne, intuitively knowing how to execute a joke or punchline. She was also subverting the kinds of roles women typically played in the musical theater. There was always an inherent sexiness about her, but on stage, vulnerability was not something she emanated. This was often handled haphazardly when casting Ethel in a romantic light, at least on stage. In Anything Goes, Reno Sweeney, strong-headed and independent, doesn't end up with the leading man Billy Crocker, but the show's eccentric English dandy Evelyn Oakley. In Panama Hattie, her character, the confident but garish Hattie Maloney, must tone herself down and assimilate before being considered appropriate for marriage. Offstage, Ethel's romantic life was intense and volatile. She would go on to carry out a very public affair with Sherman Billingsley, founder and owner of the Store Club. When he refused to leave his wife and children for her, she seemingly fell into her first and incredibly quick marriage to agent William Smith, which lasted either a few months or a few days, depending on how you look at it. She would find contentment, at least for a time, in her second marriage to newspaperman Robert Levitt, who she would often regard as the great love of her life. But his battles with alcoholism and professional troubles would be a foil to their relationship. The press engaged the novelty of Ethel's presence on the Broadway stage with scintillating speculation of her offstage life. As early as 1936, they were being fed a steady stream of stories about Ethel Merman being demanding behind the scenes. As I mentioned earlier, she was a quick study and always consistent in her performances. Some may argue too consistent. She could be thrown by a dropped line, an improvisation, and had no patience for chorus players not giving their all in the background. Most of all, she was furious if she felt that someone was trying to upstage her. While performing with comedian Bob Hope in Red Hot and Blue, he deviated from his blocking and decided to sing his verse of the song It's DeLovely while lying on the floor. At the end of the show, Ethel went directly to the show's producer, fuming, and told him to make sure that Bob Hope never did that again. Years later, while performing in a Broadway show, Ethel reportedly caught sight of a chorus girl who dared speak to a fellow cast member on stage while she was singing. At the end of the performance, Ethel cornered the stage manager, said, "Get rid of her," and just like that, the chorus girl was fired. Gossip would spread through the years that the young chorus girls in an Ethel Merman show were advised to not stand out too much, at the risk of angering their leading lady. This is contradicted at times with other accounts of Ethel Merman's cast members. When her Panama Hattie co-star, Betty Hutton, became ill, and understudy June Allison covered the role, Ethel offered to share her stage-level dressing room, rather than lugging up to the theater's third-floor chorus dressing room. As crazy as this sounds, it is possible that Ethel Merman could be both generous and terrifying backstage at once. The tricky thing about making sense of these contradictions is that many of these accounts come from stories that only become more enhanced and embellished throughout the years. Ethel's own account of her life, as she would put down in 2 separate memoirs, are not always reliable either. She could be a rousing and gregarious personality and raconteur, but at least based on accounts of her, not especially emotionally or intellectually articulate. She could view things bluntly, squarely black and white, and if she ever felt misunderstood, slighted, or betrayed in any way, her rage could be swift and merciless. While the alleged behavior in these accounts does come off as petty or, as the misogynists like to say, temperamental, I might offer, if not a pass on, then at least some context to where Ethel may have been coming from. She'd been reared up as a performer in the hurry-up-and-get-on-with-it world of nightclubs and vaudeville, performing multiple shows a day and certainly not in the most glamorous of conditions. These days had instilled in her a practicality in how she approached her work, and she had no patience with people that she felt were not focused or giving their all. As for the perceived adversarial nature towards other women in show business, I might again humbly offer that this reflects women of this time navigating a patriarchal system that is show business. When the press first started writing about Ethel, they clumsily likened her to the likes of Mae West. While one could draw parallels between their earthy personalities, the two women are vastly different, no doubt in part because of the press trying to compare the two. They reportedly regarded one another with dislike and suspicion. Another performer, Lillian Roth, who also boasted a brash singing voice reminiscent of Ethel's, would later accuse Ethel of stealing her singing style. The basis of this accusation seems largely unfounded and more related to Roth's own career difficulties. This competitiveness and these adversarial exchanges are symptomatic of the industry's restrictive space for women to thrive. If anything, these women were linked by their mutual self-confidence and independence, all in a time where their examples were seen as outliers to what was typically expected of women in entertainment. Perhaps Ethel Merman knew her ground and adamantly fought to protect it, no matter the cost. The conception of Annie Get Your Gun started with Dorothy Fields in 1945 as a suggestion to the composing team of Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein. The two had recently found success, fairly revolutionizing the Broadway theater, with story-driven book musicals like Oklahoma and Carousel. Dorothy Fields' suggestion was simple, a musical about Annie Oakley starring Ethel Merman. While Rodgers and Hammerstein passed on composing it themselves, they at least signed on to produce it. After the sudden death of the show's initial composer, Jerome Kern, Rodgers and Hammerstein proposed the project to Irving Berlin. Even then, Berlin was already something of an American institution, having composed literally hundreds of songs by this point, with dozens of Broadway shows to his credit. He had crossed paths with Ethel back in the 1930s on the set of Alexander's Ragtime Band, and marveling at her instrument, had expressed interest in writing a show for her. But Irving Berlin was also a writer of the long-gone Tin Pan Alley era, and he favored writing songs for revues rather than the newly in-fashion integrated musical, what he suspiciously referred to as the Situation Show. After some coaxing, he finally agreed, and the show set course for a New York opening in the spring of 1946. With a book by Dorothy and her brother Herbert Fields, Annie Get Your Gun tells a largely fictionalized telling of American sharpshooter Annie Oakley, her rise as a star touring in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and her romance with fellow sharpshooter and sometimes adversary Frank Butler. Annie Oakley's brash, shoot-by-the-hip, plain-talking character seemed a natural fit for Ethel, and Irving Berlin's songs like They Say It's Wonderful and There's No Business Like Show Business would go on to be Ethel Merman's staples. The role of Annie was also an evolution for Ethel, perhaps her most adult and mature role to date. As I mentioned earlier, the romantic interests of the characters Ethel played up to this point were never taken seriously. With Frank Butler in Annie Get Your Gun, she is paired with an equal, someone who does for a time regard her as a rival, before eventually loving her for who she is without being intimidated by her strength of character. There is, of course, the awkward original ending, where Annie seemingly suppresses her inherent strength to reconcile with Frank Butler. Subsequent revivals have tried to update this ending, as well as tackling the show's brazen and caricatured depiction of Indigenous Americans. Were these revisions successful? The show opened in May of 1946. Critics generally thought the show old-fashioned, rather backward to the way of the recent Rodgers and Hammerstein shows, Ethel, however, received the greatest reviews of her career up to that point. A performance that was funny, strident, and her voice as strong and as commanding as ever. She settled in for a long run, earning a whopping $4,500 a week in the show. That's approximately $75,000 adjusted to today, all while earning 10% of the show's grosses. When it came time for MGM to adapt the musical to the big screen, the prospect of Ethel reprising the role was apparently never even entertained. Judy Garland was initially cast, but eventually let go after causing delays due to exhaustion, only exacerbated by substance abuse. Eventually, the production landed with Ethel Merman's Panama Hattie co-star, Betty Hutton. Despite this, the two women remained friendly, and if she was hurt by being shut out of the film, Ethel never let on, at least to the press. Ethel played in Any Get Your Gun for nearly 3 years, practically carrying the production on her back. After a well-deserved break, she was back on Broadway again within a year, in another Irving Berlin musical, Call Me Madam. With Lindsay and Krause of Anything Goes writing the show's book, Ethel played Sally Adams, America's ambassador to Lichtenberg, really a rendering of Pearl Mesta, the ambassador to Luxembourg. The show was full of political satire and gentle ribs at the Truman administration. It also built off of Ethel's more mature persona that had come with Any Get Your Gun, as well as establishing one of the most enduring images of her in pop culture. Her hair coiffed upward, usually donning some gaudy jewelry, wearing a tasteful cocktail dress. This image would only be further established by her frequent appearances throughout the 1950s on the new medium of television. Some may know Call Me Madam as the show where Elaine Stritch, only in her 20s then, acted as Ethel Merman's standby, though according to her, she never went on. Ethel's robustness and endurance as a performer did her well throughout her career, and she rarely missed a performance. Elaine Stritch talked about this years later in her one-woman show, Elaine Stritch at Liberty, while recounting an alleged incident where Ethel physically ejected a rowdy audience member during a performance of Call Me Madam. The story, while incredibly entertaining, is most likely apocryphal and overblown, while still being faithful to Ethel's character. In fact, Ethel was rather considerate of her image, especially when the press was concerned. She knew that they were instrumental in her rise as a star, and became friendly with gossip columnists like Dorothy Kilgallen, otherwise known as the villain of the TV game show What's My Line. In the vein of any publicity is good publicity, she did little to dispel any rumors about herself, even finding opportunities to poke fun at them.
What were we arguing about, darling?
I don't know. The minute I walked out here, you started calling me names. Lovely, charming, gracious. Is that a way to introduce me? Nobody ever accused me of being lovely, charming, and gracious. Who do you think you're introducing, Mary Martin? This is Ethel Merman.
All right, darling. Drag it back to your chair and we'll start all over again.
Call Me Madam played to sold-out houses for a year and a half, and much of this was attributed to Ethel's star power. She proved so essential to the show's success that when 20th Century Fox bought the film rights, they opted to have her reprise her performance, the first time she had done so for a role of hers since Anything Goes in 1936. The film was well, if not enthusiastically received, and Ethel got her due praise. The tone in a lot of her reviews signal a shift in Ethel's perceived persona on camera, probably best exemplified by Time magazine's review. For years, Hollywood has seemed unable to make effective use of Ethel Merman. She has appeared in a number of second-rate movies, but the movie makers, fearing that rowdy Merman personality was too strong for the screen, usually tried to tone it down. When she arrived at the studio to begin Call Me Madam, she finally had a film tailored to her dimensions and was told to be herself. I think that pretty much nails it. Whereas most studios would find a younger star in her stead or try to make Ethel look younger, she's allowed to appear as a successful, working, middle-aged woman with romantic sensibilities, a remarkably cavalier move for Hollywood to make for women in the 1950s. Even in her moments on screen where she's being big, it never seems out of place, given what has come to be expected with Ethel. In fact, she reads really well on camera in this role. That is arguably her best, most fully realized performance on camera. Ethel would receive rave reviews for her next screen performance, this time on television. In 1953, the Ford Motor Company bought 2 hours of airtime for the Ford 50th anniversary show, Call Me Madam's producer, Leland Hayward, produced the event, bringing Jerome Robbins on to choreograph. As well as bringing Ethel on to sing a few numbers, he also brought on fellow Broadway star Mary Martin. She and Ethel had known and admired each other for years, and this would be their first pairing together. The program closed with a 9.5-minute medley of songs from their respective shows and other Broadway hits. There's some pretty basic staging and movement, but it was decided in rehearsals that it was most effective if the two women just sat and sang out. The format would be a staple in some of the most iconic televised performances in the years to come. In regards to the performance, the medley between Ethel and Mary is still really fun to watch today. I myself couldn't help but smile through most of it. The two are in strong voice, look really relaxed, and are clearly enjoying one another. If you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth a watch. Buoyed by her success in the film version of Call Me Madam, 20th Century Fox signed Ethel on to There's No Business Like Show Business. Like her previous appearance in Alexander's Ragtime Band, the film featured the songs of Irving Berlin with a plot built solely around his songs. While playing the matriarch of a traveling family vaudeville troupe, Ethel tries to make the best of her screen time. You can feel her modulate her performance, though she does seem to appear more and more comfortable and believable in front of the camera. But really, beyond Ethel, there's just an awful lot going on in this movie, and not a lot of investment in caring about the people in it. Ironically, producer Darryl F. Zanuck had wanted to dial back on the film's production, noting that movie musicals at this time in the 1950s were not as popular with audiences as they once were. He wanted the picture to strive for realism and personality effect rather than scope and size. Did he actually accomplish that? Despite the ridiculous roster of talent in this movie, no one really stands out enough to save it. The film would later become a critical and commercial failure. Some critics felt that the nostalgic Americana of the film had already been explored. Just a few months before this, Paramount had released White Christmas, another movie built around the hits of Irving Berlin. Any hope Ethel may have had about a career in movies at this stage of her career had come to a grinding halt. Hollywood once again letting her down. By this time, Ethel was now living in so-called retirement in Colorado with her 2 children and her now 3rd husband, head of Continental Airlines, Robert Six. But this recent rejection from Hollywood had left her feeling listless, so she threw her energy towards returning to Broadway in the new musical Happy Hunting, which was also done in part to save her struggling marriage with Robert Six. Ethel was established enough in her career to have input on the creatives she would be working with. When her husband, who was investing a large part of the show's capital, enthusiastically signed 2 new and virtually untried songwriters to pen the show's score, Ethel was uncharacteristically obliging to his decision, even though she herself was doubtful of their skills. Happy Hunting, a kind of extrapolated telling of Grace Kelly's marriage to the Prince of Monaco, premiered on Broadway in December of 1956. While audiences were thrilled to have Ethel Merman back on the stage, the show itself was quickly regarded as subpar. Ethel's instincts about the songwriting team were right, with Brooks Atkinson of the New York Times calling the show's score hardly more than adequate. Ethel herself would find trouble behind the scenes, with her and her co-star, Fernando Lamas, so at odds that they were barely on speaking terms throughout their run. And her difficulties with co-star Gene Wesson would take Ethel and Actors Equity to court on charges that she had had him fired after dyeing his hair for a movie he was auditioning for, and then refusing to change it back. The case was ultimately dismissed and resulted in American Actors Equity apologizing to Ethel, then cited as the only instance the union had ever had to formally apologize to one of its members. While the show is regarded in Merman lore as a flop, it did make $3.2 million against $500,000 and ran a respectable run of just shy of a year. The show wasn't exactly Ethel's least favorite show, but it was probably her least enjoyable time on stage, and ultimately, the show itself failed to save her marriage to Robert Six, which officially dissolved in 1960. Before then, though, Ethel would return to Broadway in a show that would be a hit, and arguably create her most iconic character. Broadway producer David Merrick had bought the stage rights for Gypsy, the memoir of Gypsy Rose Lee. While the book recounted her rise as the highest-paid stripper in burlesque, it also conjured her domineering and ambitious stage mother, Rose Hovick, who pushed both her and her sister, actress June Havoc, into show business as children. Along with co-producer Leland Hayward, Merrick envisioned this as a star vehicle for Ethel Merman, with Arthur Lawrence penning the show's book. With her blessing, Lawrence had been given license to deviate from Gypsy Rose Lee's book that, in itself, was more concerned with salaciousness and embellishments than plain facts, thus why Gypsy is often referred to as a musical fable. Lawrence had initially pitched his young West Side Story co-author, Stephen Sondheim, as the show's composer-lyricist, but Merman, once again, had input on the creatives involved. And with the memory of Happy Hunting fresh in her mind, she did not want to take a chance on a young, untried talent like Sondheim. The show's score would ultimately be composed by Julie Stein, with Sondheim eventually being convinced to supply lyrics, as he did for West Side Story. Any tensions there may have been at the beginning quickly evaporated, and within 3 months, the show's score and libretto were complete, with all writers reporting of a happy collaboration. I've talked about Ethel Merman and the legacy of Gypsy a few times on this channel. More than any other role, Mama Rose is arguably the one people most identify with Ethel. I suppose we can ask ourselves why. First, I think she benefited from, once again, having a team write to her particular persona at that time. Sondheim would clarify many years later that they weren't just writing for the character of Mama Rose, they were writing for Ethel Merman as Mama Rose, trying to take advantage of her strengths and to minimize her weaknesses. At the same time, Ethel recognized the role as her greatest professional challenge yet, not only as a singer, but as an actress, inhabiting a character whose motives veered far more into the ambiguous and gray. She may have also been desperately trying to prove herself after the Happy Hunting fiasco. Arthur Lawrence had told Ethel, "Rose is a monster. How far are you willing to go?" To which she remarkably replied, "I'll do anything you want me to." Lawrence at this time is very complimentary to Ethel as an actress in his interviews about her, only then years later being far more blunt and critical of her. Ethel was dumb. She didn't think good mother, bad mother. She thought the way that most stars thought, and I think the way many stars still think. I want the audience to like me. Such crusty comments like this are not out of the norm for Arthur Lawrence, of course. I might argue, though, that even if there is truth in his assessment, that is, Ethel wanting to be liked by the audience, it may have ultimately helped in swaying audiences from totally recoiling at the character she was playing. Rose can be a monster. She's a bully, brash, manipulative, practically neglectful to her eldest daughter, Louise, until she quite literally forces her to perform in burlesque as a late and final attempt at stardom at any cost. While being a willing subject, she would depend on the watchful eyes of Jerome Robbins. The two had first worked together back in 1939, when Robbins had been a dancer in one of her shows. From there, he had steadily established himself as both a choreographer and director, something that was still quite new for this period on Broadway. He was also establishing his well-known reputation for being something of a monster himself in rehearsals for his shows, terrorizing cast members with his mind games and abusive behavior. If Jerome Robbins and Ethel Merman ever clashed, it was always reportedly professional. The two showed a mutual respect for one another, with Ethel affectionately referring to Jerome Robbins as teacher. Robbins would find other places to direct his rage, like at actress Lane Bradbury, who would end up playing the role of June. Ethel, by the way, did little to intervene on this behavior, sometimes even partaking, as well as navigating an eventually difficult rapport backstage with actress Sandra Church, who played Louise. Upon its premiere, Gypsy was startling to both audiences and critics alike. While some were perplexed by the darkness of its themes, hinting at some of the more complex shows that would come in the next decade, Ethel received some of the best reviews of her career. She would be nominated for Best Leading Actress in a Musical at the Tony Awards that year, losing to her old friend Mary Martin for the original production of The Sound of Music. Asked to comment on the loss, Ethel simply quipped, "You can't buck a nun." Ethel had hoped her reception on Broadway would solidify her chances to play the role of Mama Rose in the movie version of Gypsy. Director Mervyn LeRoy saw the show many times on Broadway, visiting Ethel in her dressing room to assure her that no one could play the role but her. But a quiet deal had been made between the studio and producer Frederick Brisson, married to actress Rosalind Russell.
And better known as the Lizard of Roz.
The deal had ensured that Rosalind Russell would play Mama Rose, leaving Ethel feeling used and betrayed by Leroy's assurances.
Son of a bitch.
The subsequent 1962 film was a fair success at the box office, but nearly every reviewer noted the conspicuous absence of Ethel Merman. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times wrote, "For all Miss Russell's exertions, for all her pumping on the bellows of Auntie Mame and forcing as much air into her singing as her rusty vocals will bear, she misses the Merman magic and magnificence in the mama role. It takes a lot of magic to make this old biddy bearable, and Miss Russell doesn't do it for us." Ironically, the show's score had been modulated to fit Rosalind Russell's low, throaty vocals, only to be dubbed over in post-production by contralto Lisa Kirk, a further insult to injury of Ethel not getting to immortalize this performance on film. In a strange way, it is a testament to Ethel Merman that Gypsy is often entwined with the memory of her performance. It's already a sturdy piece of work, thanks to Julie Stein and Stephen Sondheim's iconic score, as well as Arthur Lawrence's sharp and well-crafted book. But with every revival comes the inevitable mention of Ethel Merman, who set the bar in this vocally demanding, dramatically galvanizing role. And every actress who plays this role comes head-to-head with comparisons of her, in terms of voice, stature, and overall command of the stage. Ethel knew that Gypsy would be the high point of her career. She would return to Broadway in 1966 to reprise her performance in Annie Get Your Gun, and her final performance in a Broadway musical was as the final Dolly Levi in the original production of Hello, Dolly, the one and only time in her career that she ever joined a show as a replacement. After this, she would feel out of step with the new crop of shows by the likes of Hal Prince, Bob Fosse, and Michael Bennett, and Stephen Sondheim, who she initially rejected due to his lack of experience, was about to enter his most influential era as a composer. She'd still make appearances on television, later citing working on The Muppets Show as one of her favorite appearances. As a singer, she would try and stay current, trying her hand at the disco craze of the 1970s, which proved entertaining for different reasons than she probably intended. She would find better success in her more traditional concert work, singing songs from her hit shows with symphony orchestras across the country, as well as taking part in a legendary one-night-only reunion performance with Mary Martin at the Broadway Theater in 1977. But Ethel understood that the kind of show that the two of them had once thrived in was now a thing of the past, and Ethel had many things to say about these modern shows and modern audiences.
How has the Broadway theater changed, in your view, since what I consider the glory days of the 30s, the 40s, and 50s of the Broadway musical theater?
I don't enjoy really going to the theater and coming out and not being able to at least hum something that I've heard on the stage. The storylines are nothing. I mean, I think I'm far from being a prude, believe me. But I don't go to the theater to see nakedness and hear four-letter words and in songs or in dialogue or whatever it is. People don't take an interest in their appearance going to the theater. They come in blue jeans cut up to here. You know, I mean, they look like they're ready for the girl's a strip act or something, and a little bra here or something. And these are the people that sit down in the second and third and fourth row in the orchestra. You look in the orchestra pit, the musicians have got white shirts on up to here. They know not even a summer jacket on. It's all disappeared. It's not the theater, I don't know, that Mary and I knew. It's not the theater that I knew.
I'm willing to concede that she makes some astute observations about audiences, observations that are still relevant today, but the overall message she is conveying is symptomatic of a familiar trope: the old generation decrying the new generation. The old guard that had made up the musical theater at this time had basically turned their backs to the cultural warfare of the time, and Broadway thus affirmed itself as an elitist and exclusive institution. It is one of many reasons the musical theater fell out with popular culture and lost the appeal of an entire generation. Ethel Merman was part of that old guard, and while there is no significant evidence of her harboring personal prejudice or disdain for things like the civil rights or women's movement, it bore no personal gain to her. Like many of her generation, she did not embrace the new voices and new stories of the Broadway theater. Rather, she received them with bemusement and resentment. Ethel's later years were tumultuous. The sudden death of her ex-husband, Robert Levitt, in 1958 would devastate her, especially with evidence that suggested a suicide. After her divorce from Robert VI, she married her fourth and final husband, Ernest Borgnine, in 1964. But after only 5 weeks, they would call it quits. Ethel recalls her marriage to Borgnine in her memoir as a single blank page. Absolutely iconic. But there would also be tragedy that would be impossible to recover from. The death of both her parents in the 1970s, with whom she had remained close all her life, and the death of her daughter to an accidental drug overdose in 1967. Her own personal struggles with alcohol, and some truly explosive stories regarding her depleting circle of friends would punctuate her last years. Before her death in 1984, she had reportedly felt like the Broadway theater had forgotten about her. The musical theater had given way to big, lavish extravaganzas, like the British mega musicals of Andrew Lloyd Webber. In this time, the shows were the stars, and performers like Ethel were left feeling even more displaced. She'd already navigated several hurdles throughout her career, narrowly entering the Broadway theater as a club singer, working hard to establish herself as a musical comedy star, further establishing herself as a capable actress in the golden age of Broadway, with her performance in Gypsy being widely regarded as one of the most legendary musical theater performances ever. But after that, the new crop of talents emerging from the 60s and beyond would cast Ethel in the background, something she fought against her whole career, both on and off stage. In remembering Ethel today, there's an instinct to caricature her persona, bringing forth the broad and superannuated aspects of her performances, which I hope people read as a loving nod rather than any intention to ridicule. Her performance style does stand in stark contrast to what we come to expect with performers today, but without Ethel Merman, there would be no Patti LuPone, no Betty Buckley or Idina Menzel, to name just a few of the big-voiced women who have made their mark on the Broadway stage. Biographer Carol Flynn said that there is no neutrality in how one feels about Ethel Merman, and I think that is key to her renowned reputation. She was a performer of a very particular time in entertainment, a woman who, for much of that time, fought to be taken for exactly who she was. Fearless, unpretentious, unwilling to bow to the expectations of others, or to be cast aside. It wasn't easy, and for all her difficulties, they likely forged an easier path for those who followed her, whether or not that was ever her intention. Regardless of how some may feel about her, one hopes that they can at least pay their respects to her career and acknowledge her indelible contributions to the musical theater, which still reverberate today.
Now, just a minute, Terry. Every television show I go on, they make snide remarks about how loud I sing. They say my voice breaks windows and mirrors and glass and...
I never said your voice breaks glass. And besides, why are you getting so excited? Keep your voice down and try whispering.
I am whispering.
See, now there goes my Helsman watch, right?